Hello and welcome back to another episode of Beyond Hell podcast. Um, in the last episode, we spent a lot of time in Jeremiah, and that was intentional because Jeremiah really is where the Valley of Hinnom takes on its most significant lasting meaning. Before Jeremiah, though, the valley was simply a geographical location outside of Jerusalem. It has its history, its associations, but at that time, it hadn't yet become a full sense symbol in the full sense of the word until Jeremiah takes it and transforms it. He takes a real place, a real event, just the Babylonian siege, and the corpses that were exposed in that valley during and after the siege, and he gives it theological significance. The valley becomes a symbol of what covenant failure actually looks like when it actually catches up to you. And once that symbolism gets embedded into Judah's cultural memory, it doesn't simply fade away. And later Jewish writers actually keep the same imagery. Sometimes they mention the valley directly, but most oftentimes they don't. But the themes keep resurfacing, which is corpse exposure, shame, judgment from covenant unfaithfulness, over and over again across the centuries of Jewish literature. So that's what this episode is going to be about. We are going to talk about the evolution of the symbol of Gehenna, and it's one of the most important things to understand because Gehenna did not suddenly appear out of nowhere in the New Testament. I think it's so important that I devoted an entire chapter in my dissertation to this particular topic of Gehenna in the Second Temple period. In fact, it's not only an entire chapter, it's actually the longest chapter in the whole dissertation. But I digress. But that development is critically important because when Jesus uses this word, he's not introducing a brand new concept to his audience. By the time you reach the first century, there's already a long-standing tradition behind this symbol. A tradition that his listeners would have recognized. And that particular tradition stretches from Deuteronomy through Jeremiah, but then into Isaiah, Daniel, even Judith, First Enoch, even into the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, known as Septuagint. So what I want to do in this episode is I want to trace how that symbolism develops across those particular texts throughout the Second Temple period. Now, what also becomes interesting, and I think this is genuinely important, is that several of the passages most commonly cited as proof texts for the doctrine of hell and Gehenna actually fit more naturally into the broader Gehenna tradition that I explained to you in the last episode. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, go back and watch the last episode. It really helps fill in the gap and really sets the beginning for where we're going with Gehenna. Now, when you read them, the Second Temple literature passages that we're talking today, when you read them in context, they're not really talking about post-mortem punishment. It's always a hard word. They're about the consequences of covenant failure. So that's where we are going to be today. That's the argument we're going to work through, Second Temple period. And let's start with probably the most significant passage in this entire tradition outside of Jeremiah himself, which is Isaiah 66:24. This verse sits at the very end of the book of Isaiah, the final image the author leads you with. And it matters enormously for our discussion because it is the passage that Jesus directly quotes in Mark 9 when he talks about Gehenna. It is the text underneath the text, so to speak. And here's what it says. And they shall go out and look at the dead bodies of the people who have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. And then if you compare that to Mark 9:47-48, which says, and if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than have two eyes and be thrown into Gehenna, where their worm never dies and their fire is never quenched. Quick side note here, I don't really like this version of the quote from Isaiah. If you look at Isaiah and Mark side by side, the Greek is exactly the same. Now, I know most can't really read Greek, so I thought this might be helpful. Here, as you can see, the NRSV UE translates the negative particle "u" as not, right? However, it also translates the same word "u" as never in Mark. And if you notice, it's the exact same Greek, so why translate it not in Isaiah, but never in Mark? Probably because it's based off assumptions about what Gehenna is. I know it might seem like semantics, but there is a difference between the word not and never. Now, I don't know. The Greek "u" is not a controversial term, right? It's fairly simple. But once you see how that one English translation of the exact same Greek word into two different English words changes things, the problem here is what I've mentioned to you already, is that our inherited traditions affect our interpretation. I think it is translated as never in Mark because Gehenna is generally assumed to be the eternal state of punishment. So it's hard to say exactly why the NSVUE translates it this way, but you can now see that even sometimes the best translations may also use assumptions to influence their translation choices, especially here when the Greek is exactly the same, less the difference between a future and present passive tense. Anyway, back to Isaiah 66:24. So, concerning this imagery, when most people hear or read of this verse in Isaiah, the immediate reaction is, well, that sounds like hell. Worms that don't die, fire that's never quenched. That's the language people associate with eternal torment. Or at least place this passage in the eschaton, right? The future, somewhere distant, out there. But I don't think that's really what Isaiah is describing or addressing here in this particular passage. You see, the people in this scene are not alive. They're not conscious. They're not being tormented in some subterranean world of eternal punishment. They are corpses. And that's one of the most important observations in this entire discussion. Because Isaiah is not describing living people suffering forever. He is describing dead bodies lying out, exposed after judgment. That's the scene, and that's the image. And that detail matters enormously because exposed corpses are not just a random or incidental image in the Hebrew Bible, as we talked about in the last episode. They are part of a very specific covenantal framework known from Deuteronomy 28:26 that we talked about at length in the last episode, the covenant curse. If Israel is unfaithful, their bodies will be left for the birds and the beasts, with no one to frighten them away and no one to bury them. And that's not just simply death, that's dishonored death. Death stripped of dignity in a culture where public shame was one of the most powerful social forces imaginable. Now, just as a little reminder about what we talked about in the last episode, burial mattered in the ancient world in ways that are really hard for us to fully appreciate. To be left unburied was one of the worst fates a person could suffer because it meant disgrace didn't end at death. It continued beyond it on display for everyone else to see. So you can see when Isaiah ends his entire book with this particular image, exposed corpses being consumed by worms and fire, he's not introducing some new theological category. He's taking the covenantal curse language from Deuteronomy and simply giving it a more vivid, more visceral, more unforgettable form. And you can see he's also building directly on Jeremiah, who already described the Valley of Slaughter as a place where corpses would be cast out, left exposed as a consequence of covenant failure. So Isaiah isn't creating something new here. He's taking Jeremiah's imagery and intensifying it. Now, the phrase that generates most debate in this verse is the language about the worm not dying and the fire not being quenched, right? For obvious reasons. And for some readers, that sounds eternal, like it's describing something that literally goes on forever. But the fire not quenched, that phrase does not automatically mean eternal or eternity or forever. And this is the one issue I take with the NRSV UE, as I briefly alluded to earlier. And we can actually demonstrate that from the text itself. Look at Jeremiah 17:27, where God says, "If you do not listen to me to keep the Sabbath day holy and carry in no burden through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath, then I will kindle a fire in its gates. It shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem and shall not be quenched." Same language, same construction in both the Greek and the Hebrew. And the Hebrew also just means not. And here I'm using the Septuagint, quoting from the Greek, to show you it's the exact same word translated as not. And no one argues that Jerusalem is, their gates are literally still on fire today, right? The expression means the judgment itself is unstoppable, irreversible, complete. Not that it is literally unending or eternal or forever. Elsewhere in Isaiah, the author also uses the same kind of language in chapter 34. He's describing Edom burning with smoke that goes up forever. Here it says, "Night and day it shall not be quenched. Its smoke shall go up forever." Now, again, Edom is not still burning. The imagery is clearly rhetorical. It's communicating a total, divisive devastation, not the ongoing eternal process. And then again, we see the same Greek "oo" here also that's in the Septuagint. So when Isaiah 66:24 says the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, it's doing the exact same thing. It's emphasizing that God's judgment is complete and unstoppable, while also being utterly humiliating. So it's not a description of eternal conscious suffering in a place called hell. It's about corpses. And honestly, if you just think about that for a moment, worms and fire can't even coexist logically. Some people have talked about this, but if the fire keeps burning, the worms are destroyed in that fire, right? It seems like a given. But if the worms are fire resistant and eternal, then we have a very different kind of problem on our hands. The point was never to describe a literal biological process. It's to create a vivid, almost unbearable image of shame and destruction that lodges itself into an ancient person's memory. Which brings us to another phrase in Isaiah 66:24 that I don't think gets enough attention. At the end, the corpses become an abhorrence to all flesh. Now, this part is significant because it's not describing what the dead are experiencing internally, it's describing how they are perceived externally. They become repulsive, they become a public spectacle, they become visible, they become an enduring warning to everyone else. So, this verse isn't about the experience of those corpses or those who are dead. It's about the reaction of the audience when they gaze upon those same dead corpses on fire. And that's exactly what the Valley of Hinnom represented in Jeremiah, a place that made the consequences of covenant failure visible and impossible to ignore. And now that Isaiah takes the same symbol and turns it into an image so stark and so memorable that it becomes the closing phrase of the entire book of Isaiah. So, in a real sense, Jeremiah and Isaiah are doing the same thing, just through different means. Jeremiah gave the valley its symbolic meaning. He attached the memory of covenant failure to a specific geographical location. Isaiah gave that same symbolism a picture that people would carry with them for generations. A picture that when Jesus later quotes in Mark 9, his audience would have recognized immediately. And we'll get to that when we talk about the Gospels. But first, there are a few more texts we need to work through because tradition doesn't stop with Isaiah. Now, once you move beyond Isaiah and you get into the Second Temple period, things get even more interesting. Because that same imagery of corpse exposure, shame, covenantal judgment, it starts showing up in different texts and different contexts. Um, but it's reaching for the same symbolism. The first one worth noting and looking at is Daniel 12:2, sort of. So Daniel says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, this verse comes up constantly in discussions about resurrection, hell, and for good reason. I mean, it really does seem like it's one of the clearest resurrection texts in the entire Hebrew Bible. But from the perspective specifically of the Gehenna tradition, Daniel is doing something a little bit more nuanced. The key is this last word here, contempt. In Hebrew, Daniel uses the rare word deraon, and that happens to be the same exact Hebrew word Isaiah uses in 66:24 when the corpses become an abhorrence. Same word. So you can see this overlap is significant because it suggests that Daniel might be consciously echoing Isaiah's imagery. But even so, Daniel isn't really working within the Valley of Hinnom tradition itself, like from Jeremiah. Isaiah is describing exposed corpses in a valley. Daniel is talking about resurrection, everlasting life, and everlasting contempt, whatever you think that means. And those are different frameworks. Daniel may simply be borrowing a word that already carries certain qualities without intending to invoke the full Gehenna tradition behind it. Although he might be evoking the image of corpse exposure with the use of that one single word, but that's another podcast episode altogether, though. I wrote a paper on this exact issue for the Journal of Old Testament Essays, so the topic can become quite nuanced. I'll do an episode on that one soon, just definitely later. So, Daniel almost certainly contributes to later Jewish ideas about judgment and postmortem punishment. And when we get to the broader topic of hell as a concept, Daniel 12:2 will be a very important conversation. But it just doesn't seem to shape the whole Valley of Hinnom or Gehenna symbolism the way Jeremiah and Isaiah do. It runs adjacent to it, but it's not central to it. But one text that's really interesting that's worth mentioning and spending a moment on is Judith 16:17. Judith is a Jewish work, likely composed from the 1st century BCE. And its author is clearly drawing on Isaiah when he writes this. Woe to the nations that rise up against my people. The Lord Almighty will take vengeance on them in the day of judgment. He will send fire and worms into their flesh. They shall weep in pain forever. Now, notice what's happening here. Fire and worms, the exact same two images from Isaiah 66:24, combined in a single verse. Now, that's obviously not coincidence. Isaiah's imagery is clearly becoming some kind of shared rhetorical vocabulary in this period. Writers are picking up on it and they're repackaging and repurposing it. But even here, the imagery is still rooted in bodily shame and physical destruction, rather than a fully developed doctrine of hell. The fire and worms are still attached to the flesh, to bodies, and to visible disgrace, exactly like they were in Isaiah. And as I mentioned with Isaiah, fire and worms can't still coexist literally. You don't get immortal worms. Again, the point was never a biological description. It's supposed to be a vivid image of humiliation and judgment that's common, actually, in ancient Near Eastern literature. It's just made visible in literary form. So even Isaiah's symbolism expands and gets picked up on by new authors. But even still, the basic themes remain consistent. The humiliation of the wicked, non-burial, judgment that is public, visible, shame as the defining consequence. And that kind of continuity is exactly what we'd expect if these authors are all drawing from the exact same well. And that brings us to what is probably the most debated text in this entire topic of the Gehenna tradition, which is 1 Enoch 27. Now, this is generally the one passage where some scholars say that the Gehenna tradition became entrenched into its connotation of hell. Here's what the passage says. I'll read the whole thing because I think it's important. Then I said, why is this land blessed and all filled with trees, but this valley is cursed? Then Sariel answered one of the holy angels who was with me and said to me, this cursed valley is for those who are cursed forever. Here will be gathered all the cursed, who utter with their mouth an improper word against the Lord and speak hard things against his glory. Here they will be gathered, and here will be their habitation at the last times, in the days of righteous judgment, in the presence of the righteous for all time. Here the godless will bless the Lord of glory, the King of eternity. Now you can see from the language of cursed valley where people might get the idea that this is the crux of the Gehenna tradition. Now, this passage, 1 Enoch 27, is one of those passages that gets invoked constantly when people want to argue specifically that the Jewish people already believed that Gehenna meant hell prior to the New Testament. And on the surface, I understand the appeal, right? Enoch sees a cursed valley. Interpreters assume it must be the Valley of Hinnom. And from there, they conclude that the Valley of Hinnom has already developed into a place of eternal punishment for the wicked. Well before Jesus ever uses that word, especially since at the end here, the author of 1 Enoch uses the word forever or eternity. But things are a little bit much more complex and quite a bit more nuanced than that. Yes, Enoch asks why the valley is cursed, while the surrounding land is blessed. The angel responds that this cursed valley is designated for those who are cursed forever, specifically those who spoke arrogant and improper words against God. And for many interpreters, that's enough. Case closed. Gehenna means hell, right? But I don't think it's as easy as some make it out to be. Some scholars, like August Dillman, argue that this valley is definitively the Valley of Hinnom, and that Jews believe that this would be the actual geographical valley where it would become the actual site of punishment for the wicked. R.H. Charles followed a similar line, suggesting the valley was cursed specifically because of its association with child sacrifice. And that interpretation, that reading, became so standard that many people today assume that 1 Enoch is the earliest reference to Gehenna as hell. The problem is that assumption runs into some serious textual difficulties. And here's the first one. And it's simple but important, is that the term Gehenna is never actually mentioned in this passage. Not once. Neither the Hebrew Gehinnom nor the Greek Gehenna appears anywhere in 1 Enoch. What interpreters are doing are making an inference based on geography, right? But even the geography isn't as settled as some people assume. So some scholars identify the valley with the Valley of Hinnom. Others think it could be the Kidron Valley, the Tyropian Valley, or even the broader valley system that encompasses all of Jerusalem. And some actually argue that it may not refer to a specific geographical location at all, that it functions symbolically within Enoch's visionary and apocalyptic world, rather than just mapping it onto the actual terrain of Jerusalem. And that last possibility deserves a bit more emphasis than it usually gets, because 1 Enoch is not trying to give us a literal map. Enoch's journeys operate within a symbolic universe. There's mountains, valleys, rivers, trees, and these are all part of what I would call his theological landscape, designed to communicate ideas about blessing, covenant, curses, faithfulness, judgment, and yes, even vindication. In fact, several scholars have pointed out that even the geography in 1 Enoch 26 and 27 seem to blend Jerusalem's topography with paradise imagery. in ways that are kind of difficult to reconstruct consistently. So, in other words, the geography is doing rhetorical work, not topographical work. So, even if the Valley of Hinnom is somewhere in the background, and it may well be, I think it does, it doesn't automatically mean that the authors are describing Gehenna as a place of eternal postmortem punishment. But what actually stands out here, as you can see, that is the most significant, isn't the geography at all. It's the language of blessings and curses. And if you watch the last episode, you understand how important that is to this topic. The valley isn't presented as cursed because it's a gateway to the underworld or because child sacrifice occurred there. It's cursed because the people associated with it are cursed here, specifically for those people who spoke arrogant words against God, who rejected his authority, who placed themselves in active opposition to the covenant. In fact, the Greek word for the word cursed here carries the sense of something standing under divine condemnation, a completed state with ongoing consequences. And that's the exact language of covenant curses. And that's the exact same framework we've been tracing since Deuteronomy 28. The valley is cursed because that's where the curse from Deuteronomy 28:26 transpired. Now, remember in the last episode, the curse from Deuteronomy 28:26 is depicted as happening in the Valley of Hinnom in both Jeremiah 7:33 and 19:6. So, if we were to call this valley something other than the Valley of Hinnom or Valley of Slaughter, it would be the Valley of the Curses or something like that. The point is that the curse from Deuteronomy 28:26 took place in this valley, hence why the cursed valley is called that in First Enoch. And it's a pretty straightforward concept once you realize the significance of Deuteronomy 28:26 and the role that that plays within the larger Gehenna tradition. And the contrast between land and the cursed valley, the blessed land actually, is striking in exactly that same light. Some scholars have suggested that it deliberately echoes the blessings and curses pronounced from Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal in Deuteronomy, which are the two mountains where Israel stood and heard what covenant faithfulness and covenant failure would look like. And so that's the background here. And then First Enoch 27 isn't really developing a new concept of hell at all. It's extending the exact same covenantal framework we've been following all along, from Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Judith, and here. So the question kind of becomes then, to some people, what makes this valley cursed? What is that curse? Because according to the text, they are condemned for speaking arrogant and improper words against God. And that's actually a major recurring theme throughout First Enoch. Again and again, the wicked are characterized by their speech. Here you can see it's hard words, proud words, words spoken against the Lord. In fact, Daniel 7 has the same motif with the little horn speaking arrogantly against God. And in the Second Temple period, the book of Tobit, Tobit pronounces curses on those who speak harshly against him. And this is consistent with the same pattern in Second Temple Jewish literature. And it's not random. These people who speak hard words are the covenant breakers. Their speech reveals pride, rebellion, but it demonstrates that they are in active opposition to God's authority. And that's where the connection to the Valley of Hinnom tradition becomes a bit more compelling. If the Valley of Hinnom tradition is standing somewhere in the background of First Enoch 27, and I genuinely think it probably is, it's almost certainly not because the valley had already become a place of eternal conscious torment or eternal punishment. It's because it had a symbol, and it became a symbol of covenant unfaithfulness, public disgrace, and death for any of those who are in active rebellion against God and his covenant, which is precisely how it functions in Jeremiah. how the valley itself functions. And so this valley becomes the valley of slaughter. Corpses are left exposed. Birds and beasts consume the dead. The people are publicly shamed because they violated the covenant of God. And so that symbolic framework actually fits within a much broader ancient pattern. In fact, valleys themselves consistently function across ancient Near Eastern literature as places of battle, death, shame, even corpse exposure. For example, the vassal treaty of Esarhaddon in the 7th century BCE utilizes curse imagery similar to Deuteronomy 20:26, threatening those who fail to uphold the portion of their treaty or covenant, stating that the god Pelil will send eagles and vultures to eat your flesh. Sounds a lot like Judith 16:17. In the campaigns of Seti I in Asia, which is around 13th century BCE, the pharaoh boasts of his victory over Canaan specifically, and he proclaims that he, end quote, prevailed over them like a fierce lion. They, the Canaanites, were made into corpses throughout their valleys, stretched out in their own blood like that which has never been. Notice what he's saying here. The people of Canaan specifically are killed and then thrown into their own valley. That's almost exactly identical. Well, it is actually to what happened later in the Valley of Hinnom during Jeremiah's time, but yet with the Babylonians. And these are just two examples. There are many, many more. Even in the Hebrew Bible, valleys are repeatedly associated with warfare, destruction. Even outside Israel, Greeks threw condemned criminals into a pit going down. Romans cast them from what's called the Terrapian Rock. And so that image of being cast down that functions or acts as a place of judgment or punishment, even disgrace because of the manner of death, it runs deep across ancient cultures. So when First Enoch describes a cursed valley with cursed people, it's likely drawing on a symbolic tradition that's centuries old. Valleys are where disgrace, divine judgment, condemnation, that's the symbolism that First Enoch is working with. And that brings me to a detail in this passage that I think is also really underappreciated. The text at the end says that the godless will one day bless the Lord of glory, the King of eternity. Now, if this place is supposed to represent a place of eternal conscious torment, or even just the beginnings of the concept, that's a very strange thing to say, isn't it? The picture isn't one of unending defiance or even unending punishment. It seems to point towards divine vindication, towards the ultimate acknowledgement of God's justice, even by those who are opposed to him. And so that's not exactly the picture most people have in mind when they think about hell. The problem is that many people stop reading after they see the phrase cursed valley and think, well, that must be where Gehenna came from. Again, remember the primary issue I mentioned before in episode 2, I believe, is that the conclusion that Gehenna means hell is already assumed. Therefore, the quest becomes finding when and where Gehenna became hell. And this verse here in First Enoch does seem tempting at first, if you already have that conclusion in mind, especially when you read the Cursed Valley and just stop there. But when you actually read First Enoch 27, what you find is not really early descriptions of Gehenna as hell. What you find is the continuation of a tradition, the same themes we've been tracing since Deuteronomy. Because of that, the valley carries the weight of the curse in Deuteronomy 20:26. The Valley of Hinnom may well be in the background because, especially if it is, it's there as a symbol of covenant curses mixed with public disgrace, not as an otherworldly realm of eternal punishment. Now, let's take a step back a bit and look at all these texts together, and a pattern comes into focus. Jeremiah gives the Valley of Hinnom its symbolic force, the Valley of Slaughter, covenant judgment made visible with a pile of exposed corpses. Isaiah actually intensifies it, the same symbol, but yet with fire and worms, turns it into the closing image of the entire book. Daniel contributes slightly the language of shame and contempt through that rare Hebrew word deraon. Judith picks up Isaiah's fire and worms and applies them to the nations who oppose God's people. And First Enoch continues working with the language of curse, disgrace, covenant faithfulness in a valley that echoes the same tradition. But through all that development across all the centuries, across different authors, different genres, different contexts, something actually remains remarkably consistent. The imagery stays rooted in the physical body, in shame, invisible judgment that encompasses corpse exposure, covenantal curses, and public disgrace. Sure, the symbol keeps evolving, but it never fully leaves behind the framework that Jeremiah originally established. And that's not an accident either, it's simply tradition. And that matters normally for how we read the New Testament, because by the time Jesus begins using the word Gehenna, it doesn't arrive out of nowhere. He's not inventing a new doctrine. He's not speaking into a vacuum. His audience already knows of the Valley of Hinnom. They know Jeremiah. They know Isaiah 66. They know the covenant curses of Deuteronomy. They know the language of corpses, fire, worms, shame, and disgrace. That whole tradition is already loaded into this one word before Jesus ever speaks it. So when his audience hears Gehenna, they are not hearing what many modern readers hear when they hear the word hell. Ancient readers heard a symbol. They heard echoes of Jeremiah's valley of slaughter, Isaiah's rebel corpses, Deuteronomy's covenant curses, and the language of defilement, exclusion, disgrace, all of it. And that's really the basis of what I wanted to really get to today throughout the Second Temple period, and to trace its evolution and development. And so this sets up perfectly how Jesus is going to use it. Now, in the next couple episodes, we're going to really look at the word Gehenna, the Greek word itself, where it comes from, the Septuagint, how the translators understood it, etc. And so we've got a little bit more work to do with this word before we really come to a full holistic understanding of what it means. So I hope to have that episode up here shortly. I thank you. If you're still watching at this point, I appreciate your time and your consideration. Thank you.